I came home one night and my door was unlocked. I had been locking it obsessively for months because of him. My first solo apartment was on the third floor of a mid-sized building in the city. It had 6 units per floor, 1 elevator, and a stairwell at the end of each hallway. I moved in on a Sunday in March, and by the evening, I had met most of my neighbors through the natural coming and going of moving day. Everyone seemed pleasant enough. Normal building, normal people. The man across the hall introduced himself the following morning. He knocked on my door while I was unpacking and handed me a small plant in a terracotta pot. He said his name was Paul and that he had lived in the building for 3 years, and that if I needed anything at all, I should feel free to knock. He must have been in his mid-40s or mid-50s, and he was soft-spoken, with the kind of careful politeness that reads as considerate rather than intrusive. I thanked him for the plant, and we talked in the doorway for a few minutes. He asked what I did for work. I told him I worked in marketing, and I kept odd hours depending on projects. He nodded and said he worked from home, so he was around most of the time and not to worry about noise. That was the extent of our first conversation. I didn't think anything of it. The first thing I noticed, maybe 3 weeks later, was that he always seemed to be in the hallway when I was leaving or coming home. Not every single time, but often enough that I started registering it. I would open my door to leave for work, and he would be stepping out of his apartment at the same moment. I would come home at 11 at night after working late, and he would be coming back from what he said was an evening walk. A few times when I came home from the gym on the weekend mornings, he was already in the hallway, seemingly waiting for the elevator, even though it was typically faster to take the stairs from the 3rd floor. I told myself it was a coincidence. Buildings are like that. You fall into rhythms with neighbors without meaning to. Then he started referencing things, small things at first. He mentioned once that he had noticed I was working late a lot that week and asked if the project I was on was stressful. I hadn't told him anything beyond the fact that I worked in marketing. Another time he mentioned that I looked like I had a good weekend, referencing a Friday night when I had my friends over for dinner. I had never told him about the dinner, and my friends had come and gone through the building lobby without stopping to introduce themselves to anyone. I started paying more attention after that. I started noticing that the doormat that I placed outside my door when I moved in was occasionally positioned differently than I left it. Not dramatically different, just slightly angled, slightly further from the door than it should have been, like someone had moved it and replaced it without being precise about it. I started placing it at a specific angle each morning before I left, so I would know. It moved 4 times in the following 3 weeks. I checked my door lock carefully after that. It was a standard deadbolt, and I was certain I was locking it every time I left. But I started double-checking obsessively, pressing my hand against the door after turning the key to make sure the bolt had fully engaged. About a month after I started doing that, I came home from a work event at 11:30 on a Thursday night, and my door swung open at the touch of the handle. It was unlocked. I stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at it, and then looked at the door across the hall. There was no light under Paul's door, no sound. I went inside and I checked every room. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but my bathroom cabinet was slightly open in a way I never left it, and the chair at my desk was angled differently than I usually left it. I went to the building manager the next morning. The building manager listened to me talk, and when I was done, he told me that Paul had previously lived in a unit in the adjacent building, which was managed by the same company. He told me Paul had been asked to relocate to my building following a complaint from a neighbor in that building. He would not tell me what the complaint was. He said it was a privacy matter, but when I pushed him and asked him if I should be concerned, he looked at me directly and said that he would personally expedite a lock change on my unit and that he would document everything I had told him. He changed the lock that afternoon. I never confronted Paul directly. I didn't feel safe doing it. I started using the other stairwell to avoid the hallway when I could, and I varied my schedule as much as possible. Paul still appeared in the hallway occasionally, but less often than before, as if the new lock had communicated something to him without words. I moved out about 4 months later, when my lease was up. I gave the building manager a forwarding address for my deposit check, and I asked him not to share it with anyone in the building. He told me that that was a good idea. I've thought a lot since then about the complaint from the previous building, about what would prompt a building management company to relocate a tenant rather than evict them, about what the neighbor in that other building must have experienced to make that complaint in the first place. I never found out what it was. I'm not sure I want to. He was always standing in his yard when I looked out the window, always perfectly still, always facing our house. We moved to Callaway Street in the summer when our youngest was 4 and our oldest was 9. It was a quiet residential street, the kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave from their driveways. We'd looked at a lot of houses before we found ours, and from the first walkthrough, it felt right. There were 11 houses on our street. We introduced ourselves to all our neighbors in the first few weeks, except for one. The house at the end of the street, on the left side, had its curtains drawn on every window every time I walked past it. There was a car in the driveway, an older model sedan that was always there, and the lawn was maintained just well enough that it didn't stand out. But in 2 months of living on that street, I never saw anyone come or go from it. I mentioned it to our neighbor across the road, a retired teacher named Margaret who had lived on Callaway Street for 20 years. I asked if she knew the person who lived there. She looked at the end of the street briefly and then looked back at me. "He keeps to himself," she said, and then she changed the subject so smoothly and completely that I didn't think to push it until later. I got the same response from the 2 other neighbors I asked, a brief glance toward the end of the street, a short non-committal answer, and then a subject change. Nobody was rude about it. Nobody seemed frightened exactly. They just clearly did not want to discuss it. I let it go. Some people are private. My dog Rosie was a 4-year-old Labrador, calm and friendly with everyone she ever encountered in her life. About 6 weeks after we moved in, I took her for an evening walk, and as we approached the end of the street, she stopped. She planted her feet and refused to move forward. I'd never seen her do that before. I coaxed her for a minute, and she wouldn't budge, so I turned around and went the other way. I told my wife about it, and we laughed it off as a dog being a dog. She did it every single time after that. Every walk, every time we approached within about 4 houses of the end of the street, she would stop and refuse to go any further. Eventually, I stopped trying to take her that direction entirely. The first time I saw the man from the end house was on a Tuesday evening in October. I was washing the dishes at the kitchen sink, which faced the backyard, and I happened to glance out the window that looks down the side of the house toward the street. He was standing in his front yard, at the edge of his property, facing our house. He was just standing there, still and straight, hands at his sides. I couldn't make out his features clearly from that distance, but his orientation was unmistakable. He was looking directly at our house. I watched him for a few minutes, and he didn't move. I went to get my wife, but by the time we came back to the window, he was gone. It happened again the following week, and the week after that, always in the evening, always from the same spot at the edge of his property, always facing our house. I never saw him move. I never saw him arrive or leave his spot. He was just there one moment, and then gone the next. My wife started keeping a log of the dates and times. In 6 weeks, she recorded 11 separate sightings. Then our youngest, Emma, started talking about that man. She mentioned him first at dinner one evening in November. She said the man from the end house had come to visit her in her room the previous night. She said it in the matter-of-fact way that 4-year-olds describe things that adults have no framework for, somewhere between a dream and a memory. My wife and I exchanged a look and kept our voices even. We asked her to describe what he looked like. She described a tall man with dark hair going gray at the sides, a long face, very pale, and she said he stood at the end of her bed and didn't say anything. She said he just looked at her. We had never pointed that man out to Emma. We had never described him to her. She had no way of knowing what he looked like, but her description matched what I had seen standing at the edge of that property on those 11 evenings. We checked her room thoroughly that night, and every night after that. Every window was locked. The door was a simple push-button lock, and we started engaging it at bedtime. We did not tell Emma anything that would frighten her. We just told her that if the man visited her again, she should come and wake us up immediately. I went to the end of the street the following Saturday morning and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. I knocked again and waited. The curtains in the front window moved slightly. Something behind them adjusted, but the door did not open. I went to the local non-emergency police line that afternoon and reported what had been happening. The officer I spoke to was polite and took notes, but he told me that without evidence of a specific crime, there was limited action they could take. He did offer to do a wellness check on the property. 2 officers went to the door 2 days later. They noted that the property appeared occupied and that there was no indication of anything requiring intervention, so they closed the case. We put our house on the market in January. We were gone by March. Before we left, I spoke to Margaret one last time. I told her about Emma, about the descriptions, about the 11 evenings at the edge of the property. This time she didn't change the subject. She just looked at me for a long moment and then looked down at her hands. "How long has he lived there?" I asked her.
"I'm not sure exactly," she said quietly. "He was there when I moved in 20 years ago.
She paused.
I've never seen him age."
I didn't ask anything else. I thanked her and went back inside and finished packing. I don't know what was in that house. I don't know what stood at the edge of that property on 11 October evenings, looking at my home. I don't know what stood at the end of my daughter's bed in the dark. But Emma still talks about the man sometimes, less often now than before. She says he hasn't visited since we moved. She said this casually, the way that she might mention a neighbor she used to see on the way home from school. I hope she's right. I hope the house is what he wanted, and not our child. The previous owners of our house left in the middle of the night without telling anyone. Now I think I know why. My wife and I bought our house in a rural area about 30 miles outside the city. It was a deliberate choice. We wanted space, quiet, and land. The nearest neighbor was a quarter mile down a gravel road, and that suited us perfectly. His name was Garrett. He knocked on our door the morning after we moved in, carrying a covered dish and a bottle of wine, and wearing the kind of easy, open smile that makes you feel immediately at ease. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with a weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outside. He told us his family had owned their land for 3 generations, and that he was the last of them. He said he was glad to finally have neighbors again. We invited him in. He stayed for 2 hours and was excellent company. He knew the area well and gave us genuinely useful information about the roads in winter, where to get firewood, which contractors in town were honest, and which ones to avoid. When he left, my wife said she thought we'd gotten lucky with the neighbors. Over the following weeks, he came by regularly, always with something, food or something he'd fixed that he thought we might need, or information about something going on in the area. He helped me replace a section of the fence that had come down and refused to take any payment for his time. He brought my wife flowers from his garden when she mentioned that she had a hard week at work. He was, by any measure, a wonderful neighbor, but things started adding up in ways I couldn't dismiss. He had an almost uncanny sense of when something had gone wrong. My truck broke down on the country road one morning before I'd had the chance to call anyone, and Garrett's truck appeared within 15 minutes. When my wife and I had a bad argument late one evening, he appeared at the door the following morning asking if everything was all right, saying he thought he might have heard something the night before. Our houses were a quarter mile apart, and the argument had taken place in our kitchen with the windows closed. Another time I came home from a hardware run to find him in our backyard. He said he had seen our back gate was open from the road and didn't want our dog to get out. Our back gate was not visible from the road. I started noticing other things. A book moved on the shelf in my office. A drawer in my wife's studio that she always kept closed was slightly open. A muddy boot print on the concrete just outside our back door on a morning after 2 dry days, the most recent previous day Garrett had visited us. I didn't say anything to my wife at first. I didn't want to alarm her without being certain, but I started paying careful attention to things in the house. I started noting the position of objects before I left for any length of time. Over the course of 6 weeks, I confirmed that someone had been inside our home at least 4 times while we were out. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. Things were just slightly not where we had left them. I confronted Garrett on a Sunday afternoon. I drove to his property and knocked on the door, and when he answered, I told him calmly and directly that I believed that he was inside our home without our permission, and that I needed him to explain himself. He looked at me for a long moment. He didn't get angry. He didn't deny it. He didn't look guilty or caught out. He just looked at me with that same easy expression he always wore and said that he was just looking out for us, that good neighbors look out for each other, that we were new to the area and didn't understand yet how things worked out here. He said it with a patience and a certainty that made my skin crawl in a way that I still find difficult to fully describe, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who simply wasn't grasping it yet. I told him to stay off our property. I told him if I found evidence he had been in our home again, I would go to the police. He nodded slowly, still with that same calm expression, and said he understood. He said he hoped it wouldn't come to that. I drove home with my hands tied on the steering wheel. 2 weeks later, I was in town and stopped at the real estate office where we had purchased our house. I wanted to ask about the previous owners. A couple who our agent had mentioned had relocated out of state. I asked why they had sold. The agent got a slightly careful look on her face. She said they had decided quite suddenly that rural life wasn't for them. She said that they had contacted her from a motel in the next county, said that they had already left the property and wanted to list it immediately. She said they were very motivated sellers and had accepted the first reasonable offer without negotiation. I asked if she knew why they had left so suddenly. She said she didn't know the details, but then she said something that has stayed with me. She said that in her experience, when people leave a rural property in a hurry in the middle of the night, they're usually leaving something behind rather than going towards something new. I asked if their departure had anything to do with the neighbor down the road. She looked at her desk and straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. Then she looked back up and said she really couldn't comment on that. My wife and I sold the house 18 months after we bought it. We took a loss on it because we priced it to move quickly. I still think about Garrett sometimes, about how calm he was when I confronted him, about the previous owners in their motel room deciding in the middle of the night that they needed to leave immediately and never go back, about how long he had been there on that land, 3 generations of his family, and then just him, alone, waiting for new neighbors to arrive. I hope whoever bought our house after us is doing all right. I hope they knocked on his door with a covered dish and a bottle of wine and found him to be a wonderful neighbor, but I hope they pay attention to where they leave things